Hello and welcome to Data Founders, a series of interviews with entrepreneurs and investors. Mostly we are focused on data science and associated things. My name is Peter Zhegin and I'm talking to Kashish, who is a co-founder and HighTouch. And basically HighTouch is a data platform that helps you to sync all your customer data from your data warehouses to your CRM and to some other tools. It's a pleasure to have you here, Kashish.
Thanks, Peter. It's great to be here.
Nice. So to kick off, maybe you can tell us a bit more about what HighTouch does and about yourself as well.
Sure. HighTouch very simply helps companies get data from their data warehouse into their SaaS tools. And the whole idea is that you've already done the job of centralizing your data in your data warehouse. And it's going to be a BigQuery, a Snowflake, a Redshift, something along those lines, where the data has already been centralized and ingested with something like Fivetran or Stitch or some in-house ETL pipeline. And now you've done transformations on top of that data warehouse in order to make the data useful and clean. And the last leg is getting the data back into the hands of your business users in the tools where they live, such as their CRM, their marketing tool, their support tool, their account management tool, whatever they use. And so basically we build those data pipelines for you out of the box. And how it works is you simply give us a SQL query and we pipe the results of that SQL query continuously to your SaaS tool. So anyone that knows SQL can use HighTouch really easily without having to know how to write code or how to manage data pipelines.
Yeah, that's nice. And what's about you? What's your role and what's your background, just for our listeners to understand a bit more about that?
Yeah, I basically graduated with a master's in robotics in 2018, and since then have been working on startups. My first startup was in the travel world, completely unrelated to data, with Tejas. And since then, we've had a few pivots in the data world. So we worked on customer success, we worked on customer communications, customer dashboards, and then finally, we worked on what we're working on now, which is getting data into the hands of business users, rather than through dashboard, rather just piping it into the tools they already use. So my background is primarily in computer science and robotics. I also studied business at the University of Pennsylvania, and yeah, I've been in SF for about 3 years now.
Nice, nice. And you already mentioned a bunch of interesting things. You mentioned kind of evolution of the company from travel, from different types of products to data and to pipelines. But before that, you mentioned an interesting, I would say, a trend maybe. You mentioned Snowflake and Redshift and this data warehouse thing. How does it relevant to you guys? And is it a trend that you are basically riding on? And what's inside of that trend, if you might?
Yeah, so maybe the best way to describe this is we were working on a product to help companies build dashboards on their data. And we were pulling in data from all their different CRMs and databases and so on. And every single customer we talk to past a certain size says, hey, we don't need you to pull data from our tools and from our databases. We actually already did that. We already ETL'd that data into our data warehouse. And the data warehouse is becoming the central source of truth for our company because it's the fastest and cheapest place to store data currently. And so that was kind of the light bulb moment for us, which is that it doesn't actually make sense anymore for SaaS tools to store your data or for CDPs to store your data because customers have already, like companies have already centralized their data in a data warehouse that they manage and they own themselves. So like that was a kind of the pivoting moment when we realized that that's the correct source for any ETL, like any reverse ETL pipeline. And when you can standardize around the source, you can actually do a lot of like nice things, such as like knowing what the structure of the data is going to be and do things in batch and do things like less ephemerally. So you can always maintain the data consistency that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting, and I
Um,
get it.
and one thing to point out there is that data warehouses weren't always useful for operational tasks. In the past, you would have considered a data warehouse the place where you run queries for a few hours overnight and then get the results in the morning because they were a lot slower. But because Snowflake and BigQuery have separated storage from compute, um, you're able to get a data warehouse that has significantly more compute resources than you'd usually be able to afford, which means your queries are running way faster. And the fact that you're able to run much faster queries on your data warehouse means that you're able to use your data warehouse much more often and run queries much more often. So instead of thinking of it as a nightly job, you can think of it as ETLing data every 10 minutes or every 30 minutes, which is usually fast enough for most marketing and most sales workflows.
Mhm, mhm. Actually, it's very good that you mentioned that's a fantastic trend change at the infrastructure layer,
Hmm.
right? That allows us and others to look at data warehouses from a bit different perspective, from an operational standpoint. Correct me if I'm wrong. There is another interesting trend within this data warehouse thing is that they also, Snowflake in particular, they also push for multi-cluster shared data architecture. So it's kind of makes things easier to share and maybe to share within an organization and also across
Hmm.
your customers maybe, etc. Is it
Hmm.
something that you're looking also as well, or it's less of your concerns?
It's something that we primarily benefit from,
Mm-hmm.
not so much something that we're utilizing in our own architecture. But if you think about it, right, like you might have a really big company such as Walmart or Target, and they have several business units that effectively function as separate businesses. And in the old world, you would have had each business unit have its own database or
Mm-hmm.
like its multiple databases and its own data warehouse. So now the fact that you're able to conglomerate everything into one and then have a shared data team that serves all the business units is pretty interesting. And we see like several of our customers asking for that, which is that they're a conglomerate of 4 or 5 different brands and they want to share data across those different brands in order to do things like co-marketing or share identified users across different brands that have landed on different domains. And so that was much harder to do when you had to share data between different databases that are not on the same rack. But if you can kind of consider them in the same ecosystem and then like one Snowflake query can join across all the different databases, it's much easier to run one data team on multiple business units.
Mhm. Cool, cool. And I'm curious about how did you arrive to that light bulb moment? Like, what was your maybe framework or mental model, or it was purely coincidental? But I'm not sure. I guess you were looking at the stack, trying to understand what's happening there, and how somebody else may spot that kind of changes to build on them, to build a startup on them. What would be your advice to a potential
Yeah,
founder?
there was a couple things. Primarily, it was the customer feedback that we got for our past ideas. So every time we pitched an idea to a customer, they came back to us saying, "Well, that sounds really awesome, and we want it for sure. But first, do this other thing for us." And the other thing always led us closer and closer to what high touch was. So, for example, like when we were working on the customer dashboard idea, what we were doing is we were building a dashboard where you can view everything about a customer. So, like all actions the customers take in, website views, like sales events, marketing events, etc. And when we were building that, like every customer had said, well, this sounds awesome, but you can actually just take data from our data warehouse in order to display this to our business users because it's already there. And then we were thinking, well, that's kind of similar to Looker or like Metabase or Tableau. The data is also displayed by those tools. What's new here? And then they said, well, like what would be really interesting is if I could take actions on this data, like initiate refund or like create assign account manager to this account because they've added a credit card, that kind of stuff. And so that's what led us to realizing that getting data in tools where the business user lives is actually much more useful because then they can take action on that data within their tools.
Mhm.
So like, for example, if you get data into a CRM, it's not just that you're getting data into the CRM, it's that once the data is there, now you can run workflows on that data, or you can create triggers based on that data that alert you when certain things happen.
Mhm.
And so there's a much higher ROI on having it in operational tools rather than just having it in analytic tools.
Mhm.
And that's like the big difference between BI and like what we call operational analytics,
Mhm.
because BI is basically like running reports on data to do analysis, whereas operational analytics is taking that analysis, sending it to the business user and letting them take action on it.
Mhm. Mhm. Cool, cool. So you basically highlighted the importance of customer feedback, and I guess that's a
Yeah.
cornerstone to build something new. What would be
And
your, yeah,
there
sorry.
was another thing as well, though. Like both of my co-founders were early at Segment,
Mhm.
and they had like it's like Segment's architecture is pretty different from us, but fundamentally, like they also help companies get data into other places, right? So like the difference is that Segment stores the data for you, and when it stores that data for you, you have to store data in Segment's format. And so like until sometime in 2020, we had obviously thought that that was the correct way of doing things because that's what we were most used to. And they had worked at Segment for so many years.
Mhm.
And it took like a big light bulb moment with customers to say, wait, the data warehouse should actually be the source
Mhm.
and that they don't need Segment to store data for them anymore because they have their own Snowflake and BigQuery.
Mhm.
So like in the end of the day, like if Segment is running BigQuery for you versus you're running your own BigQuery, you'd much rather use your own. and then be able to use any schema that you have, and then be able to proliferate that schema out to other destinations. And so like it wasn't something super automatic until the customers had continuously said, no, the data warehouse is correct. And then we realized, wait, we should actually build some data warehouse. And the architecture for something like a CDP that was built today would not be what it was 7 years ago when you store data for customers.
Yeah, I see. And um, you mentioned a couple of specific features of the different larger existing systems, like Segment and some other. There is one feature that sometimes people take into consideration. It is being open source. For instance, if you work in a certain segment, I mean, the part of the market, you may have a larger players who are open sourced, and you basically utilize what they have. My understanding that in your case, a lot of these data warehouses like Snowflake and others, they're commercial, they're not open source. Was it something that you considered, or it was just accepted as a given? They are not open source, that's okay for us. What was your thinking there? And how others, how founders may think about open source versus closed source or commercial models?
In the case of the data warehouse itself, it's pretty reasonable for companies to continue like adopting the closed source models like Snowflake and BigQuery have. And the reason is like you always had the ability to run your own data warehouse and your own cluster, like your own Hadoop cluster, right? It just takes a lot of effort. You need to hire several engineers to do so, and you're gonna have to maintain it like crazy. So it's not like the technology didn't exist. It was just very expensive to run like the resources for it. And it was just very difficult to maintain and architect. Whereas, and then like, on the other hand, like if you use Snowflake or BigQuery, you benefit from the shared compute resources that you share with everyone else, right? So the fact that you're able to only pay for compute when data is loaded into memory, rather than data always being loaded into memory, is novel. And that's like fundamentally like not something that you really build for yourself. It's just something that like the cloud providers are building for you. So I think people don't have any problem, and I might be wrong about this, so don't quote me here, but I think they have no problem paying for like the closed source model that like Snowflake and BigQuery have. And then even on our side, like Fivetran, for example, is not open source. And the reason they're able to do that is because the quality of their integrations is just significantly better than other players. We think that's going to be the same thing for us as well. We have already kind of seen this where like integration quality does matter. And there's much more depth to an integration than you'd think. So like in the early days, you'll think like, oh, if I simply get data into the contact object and the account object in my integration, like Salesforce, I'm good to go. But then you realize that reverse ETL is not simply just getting data into Salesforce. Sometimes it's getting data into Salesforce into the right place. Sometimes it's getting data into Salesforce and then converting that object into something else in Salesforce, like converting a lead into a contact. Sometimes it's creating opportunities in Salesforce and assigning AEs to those opportunities. And so there's all these different workflows that you can actually build via reverse ETL, because all you're really trying to do is model your Salesforce instance after your database or your data warehouse. And when you're doing that, you actually need to take like several different actions, like create task in Salesforce, create opportunity in Salesforce, assign manager in Salesforce, all that kind of stuff, which Hightouch can power. And it already does power those things.
Yeah. So if we try to generalize from here and to, obviously it's not an advice, there is no kind of one size fits all solution, right? But if we think for someone who considers open source versus commercial, so if the qualities of integrations is very high and complex, and if you have kind of shared resources built by somebody else, then there is a sense to do commercial license, for instance. Doesn't sound like a valid generalization to you. Or maybe something that I generalized based on what you said.
Yeah, there's all these other ways of like, for example, there's like, you could deploy Hightouch into someone else's VPC, right? So for example, if we were to give you Hightouch and say, hey, you can deploy it now in your AWS, we won't deploy it for you. You just deploy it for yourself, but we're not like necessarily sharing like the source code with you. That's like one example of a way to guarantee that the user has full control and security, but doesn't have to like worry about like understanding our code, right? So there's a lot of different ways where we don't have to worry that much about like customers being able to run Hightouch themselves. One more thing that makes it really easy to tell a good security story around Hightouch, and this is kind of just inherently true based on working on the data warehouse, is that we don't store customer data. So like because of the fact that we use your data warehouse as the storage for your customer data, we prefer to and don't have to store any data on our side whatsoever, not even temporarily. So like the way our high touch works is it'll run the query on your warehouse. It'll store it in your S3 bucket because we need to temporarily diff the data between different runs
Mhm.
so that we only send new and updated data to the end destination. And then we send it to your end destination, which is like your CRM or your marketing tool. And the beauty of that is that it really never ever lives in any of our data stores, which means we're never custodians of your data. It's pretty much just passing through for compute and that's it. Um, so the fact that we're able to do that means that like already customers don't care too much about being able to run it themselves, because the primary reason they'd want to do so is for some level of control
Yeah.
or for some level of security.
Mhm.
And on the control side, like I think one thing that we've done a really excellent job of is building a really good developer experience. So we went to every data engineer we could find and asked them, if you had unlimited time and resources to build this, what would you think of and what would you do? And they gave us like this huge list of things that like they had not built in house, but like they wanted a debugging console. They wanted to know like which rows were or were not synced. They wanted to be able to retry rows that failed and save those for later and all this kind of stuff. And we actually built that and it's actually live. So
Mhm.
like even things as granular as being able to see exactly what requests, HTTP requests, high touch sends to Salesforce and what the return is. We show you all those things, so you
Super
don't have to build your own error logging.
Yeah, it's super transparent, really.
Yeah, which is like oftentimes people would want an open source tool because they want to be able to error log everything that goes in and out, but we already provided those logs, so like kind of makes it so that like you don't need to run it yourself anymore.
Interesting, really interesting. And when you were talking with these developers trying to understand at very high detail what do they need, were you building simultaneously some other products, or you decided that you focus on this particular idea and you just needed to get some more details? What was your approach to maybe not pivoting, but maybe iterating between different products
Yeah.
we mentioned before? I guess there is something interesting there.
Yeah, and that's honestly like one of the hardest things about like early customers. It's like you have to balance selling them and then learning from them as at the
Hmm.
same time. So I think we honestly got like very fortunate to have the right design partners early on, where they would tell us like, okay, we're down to use this, we're signing a contract, but now here's the 7 things that you should work on in the next few months, and we want those you to build them for us. So one example of those is our first customer ever actually said, hey, I want to use high touch to ETL data from BigQuery into Postgres. And we never thought about that because we never thought like SQL database to SQL database, right? We thought always like, all right, it has to go to some SaaS tool. And their whole use case was, we want to serve personalization as an API for our product team,
Hmm.
but our data team has all the data for like what personalization algorithms and like data science we want to do to show people certain things, right? And so the only way we can serve this in real time is if it's in some faster data store, not BigQuery, but something like Postgres. But we only need to do the ETL every like hour because we want to update the personalization every hour. But we want to serve it in a few milliseconds to the iOS app. And so that was like, we didn't think about it ourselves, right? They thought of it for us. They said, here, you should do this. And then we did it. And like, those are the kinds of things where customers come up with features for us that we never really thought of high touch being used for.
Hmm.
But now it's like actually like a common use case.
Hmm.
Um, Same goes for a lot of the developer features, but like I think in the early days we were really focused on just making something functional that would do the job of getting data from point A to point B.
Hmm.
And then as we got more and more users in the app, they started saying like, "Oh, what if you showed me this, or what if you showed me that?" And they were all really natural extensions. So, for example, like debugging is really useful because it not only helps us understand what is happening
Hmm.
when high touch fails or succeeds, it helps the customer understand what is happening when high touch fails or succeeds. So it means that we have to do less handholding to help them figure out why sync is not working.
Hmm. Hmm. Cool, cool. And what other people can do to filter out through customers' feedback and maybe to focus on these important things that needs to be done and maybe to decline and cancel and just not to do some others because I'm sure that you got a lot of different requests and you needed to
Yeah.
prioritize them somehow, right?
Yeah.
What could be the approach here?
I'll say 2 things. We made this mistake in the earlier days and got better at this, which is that founders feel the need to like sell their product over and over. Like, this is why it's good. You got to use it for these reasons. And if instead of selling, and by the way, Calvin French Owen from Segment, he's the one that taught us this idea. If you approach with the idea of consulting rather than selling in the early days, then you'll get so much more feedback about like, this is kind of correct, but here's the other things that you should think about. and then you'll be able to quickly iterate your idea to the other things that might be much better fit, right? So like instead of selling like, hey, you got to use this dashboard thing that we have, like we came a little bit more open-minded after a few pivots and after learning this kind of concept. And because of that open-mindedness, customers led us to the data warehouse and they led us to ETLing data into SaaS tools. And we heard it enough times from different customers that we thought, okay, this is a clear pattern and it's a very clear need. The other thing I'll say is on in terms of like choosing which feedback to listen to and which feedback is like maybe like to be done later. It's really easy to do that when you have multiple customers asking for the same thing versus only one person asking for that thing. And it's also really easy to do that if like the feature was already on the engineering roadmap versus not. So I think we're fairly lucky in that most of our customers have been asking for very reasonable things that several other customers asked for as well. And we're also lucky that like we have really good engineers that can work pretty quickly. So like generally like we'll say like, oh, we can have this done in 2 weeks and we'll add it to our engineering roadmap. And then someone on our team will get excited by it and then they'll get it done in 2 days. And so like, I wish I had a better answer there. But we haven't struggled with it too much given that the requests are very reasonable for us.
I assume, did you guys have a dedicated maybe commercial person or somebody from founders was actually providing these multiple customers that you can talk to? Because what I see with the deep tech teams is that sometimes they don't have a dedicated commercial resource. And maybe even the founding team is 100% engineering or technical. So they really struggle to get multiple customer conversation simultaneously, so they go one by one, and that doesn't allow them to get the request that is repeated by multiple customers. So what was your approach and what somebody else can do as well?
Yeah.
To get this multiple customers at a time.
Yeah, through each pivot, we developed like a larger network. And also like, because we've been in SF like long enough, we're able to find a lot of early design partners through our network. So that definitely made it easier to find the initial customers. We did hire an AE fairly early on. So our first AE hire was in December of 2020. I don't know, I'm not sure if that counts as earlier than most companies or not, but that also helped quite a bit in getting introduced to customers. But like generally, like because we have a pretty large cap table of investors, we're able to get introductions through them pretty easily. And it's much more difficult to identify who to get introduced to and like why they're a good fit for High Touch than it is to figure out like how to find that introduction. So like targeting is difficult and like figuring out the right persona. But once we've done that, we actually have quite a bit of privilege when it comes to our network. And like, I don't deny that like a lot of it is because of our network. One thing to mention there, I actually just remembered, is a large amount of our like design success has been due to shared Slack channels with our customers. So pretty much every customer that we've ever worked with, we have a shared Slack channel with. And as they come up with feedback or questions, they ask us nonstop. And so like Tejas and I are probably spending like several hours a day responding to customers on Slack. And they're giving us feedback or asking us questions or asking for help onboarding. And it makes a huge difference because instead of having to get on the phone or talk to someone live, they're able to ask questions in Slack where they already are. And so they feel much more comfortable asking questions as they come up. And like you'll be amazed at the level of detail that they're asking about. They'll be like, okay, like exactly how does this work, followed by that, and can we do it this way instead? And then we'll loop in an engineer. The engineer will think about it, and then the engineer will talk live. And because a lot of our customers are technical, the conversation is pretty fluid, where it feels like High Touch is just a part of your data team. Like the High Touch team is part of your data team, and they're helping you figure out data problems.
Cool. And you mentioned that you spent paid a lot of attention to identifying the right customers and the right persona within a customer. I guess you definitely need to have that if you want to have that depth of relationships and that sort of relationships when a customer feels you as a part of a data team, right? What would be your advice on that? How founders can sift through multiple opportunities and select those that really resonate with their product and with the team?
Yeah. So one thing that is like kind of obvious is just trial and error. So if you talk to like all the different personas that are relevant, that is for sure very like the tried and true way. One thing that is less easy to understand is asking each stakeholder who in your company is responsible for this, who in your company should be handling this, and who in your company should we talk to. So for example, in Hightouch, it was extremely clear. Um, Truthfully, we started off selling to marketers. So we thought Hightouch was going to be a tool used by marketers to get data into their marketing tools, and that it was not going to, like, it was just a way to get around the data team and like get data without relying on the data team, right? So that's what we started off with. We pitched marketers, and we had like 30, 40 conversations with marketing teams, and each conversation went pretty well because they were like, yes, we definitely need this tool and it's going to solve our problem. Go talk to our data team about whether you should use it or not. And every time they said, my data team is responsible for this and they're going to be the end decision maker. I just want to be the benefactor of the data. I don't want to solve the problem, but like I need the problem to be solved for me, right? So once we saw this enough times, like we started realizing that every time we talk to a marketing team, what we really want to do is either find marketing ops that's technical enough to set this up, or the marketer that's technical to set this up, or get an introduction to the data team. And the data team will come in and really resonate with our problem, right? But like, it was a pretty big difference when we started talking about warehouses with marketers versus data teams, because the data team just said, oh yeah, like, oh sorry, like the marketing team said, like the data is there somewhere on the data team side, and I know I can get it, I just don't know how. Whereas the data team was really resonating with the fact that we do care about the how, we do care that it's from the warehouse, and that it should be done in this way. It cannot be done in a different way, like through some workflow automation, for example. So like the fact that we continuously got introduced to data teams from marketing teams, and same for sales ops. Sales ops were often introduced to data teams as well. It kind of became a pattern, and we realized that whereas marketers and sales people are getting tools suggested to them every single day, like they probably receive 5 emails a day saying, hey, we can help you with this thing. Data teams are underserved and they have no tool that does directly what they need to do. And so like that also was a big decision-making factor, where we said like, sure, we could probably sell this to either one, but data teams understand the need and the how better. And like, there's no one bothering them all the time about reverse ETL and CDPs and that kind of stuff. They're actually just building in-house. So it was both like the easiness factor and the like value prop factor.
Interestingly, maybe it's a specific of actually what you are doing with reverse ETL, but I've heard from, I guess, 2 or 3 guests on the podcast that actually data teams and data scientists are among those who are very difficult to penetrate because there are a lot of hype around it, and there are a lot of data ops, model ops, whatever new type of startups that actually try to reach data guys quite frequently. And it's actually a challenge for many startups to get through, to get this attention, given that a lot of new tools pop up immediately. So it might be a specific of what you are doing, or maybe you are doing something to get this attention better. So what do you think it is more? You know how to get this attention, or it's like really a very, very open opportunity. Nobody else does that, so you get this attention either way.
Yeah, it's 2 things. The very truthful answer is that like the data work we're doing is the work that no one wants to do. So for example, if you're doing transformations or like cleaning or like something that is very core to what the data team should be doing and is good at doing, then like the data team doesn't want to give away that work, right? Because they want to do it custom, like identity resolution, for example. That's something that's pretty custom to every big company, and they can't simply give it away because they have their own algorithms for identity resolution. Getting data into SaaS tools where you're writing against REST APIs for things like Salesforce or HubSpot, it's pretty much work that no one really wants to do. They're tasked with doing it, and it's like important to the business. But does the data team like enjoy doing it? No, they don't enjoy doing it. And that makes it a lot easier for us to talk to data teams and say, hey, we do this work for you that you don't like. And we do it extremely reliably and extremely effectively and robustly, right? So like that makes it a lot easier. The thing I do resonate with when people say that data teams are hard to sell to is that like they're pretty hard to impress. So whereas like you can impress a marketing team much more easily, when you go to a data team, you tell them like, here's what the thing does. And then they'll be like, oh, but like I can do it better. Like I know how to write this code. Like it's not that difficult for me to do it, right? And so you have to actually dig deep and say, okay, like if you built a pipeline, would you have thought about this? Or would you have thought about that? Or would you have like done all this work to make sure that API limits are not reached and that things are retried? And then you have to go into the intricacies of like the data workflow before they actually become impressed with your tool and not see it as a utility. So the impressiveness factor is tough, and they're pretty hard to like convinced that like this shouldn't be built in-house. But we've been seeing that change pretty rapidly compared to like 3 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
Like now we show people our tool and they actually think it's better than in-house. And the reason is because we actually made those efforts to make it better than in-house.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I see. I can absolutely, even being non-technical person, I can definitely resonate with. I basically see sometimes how internal teams really um, characterize something as easy. We can do it in house. We can build it. I can build it.
Yeah.
Yeah, guys, that's true. But why didn't you build it, given all these resources that you have?
And
It's,
because they
it's
have like 100 other things to do. Yeah.
Yes, yes. It's sometimes really an illusion, I guess, that a person of a certain qualities with certain experience can build anything, which is true
Yeah.
in the kind of virtual world, but not in the real one. Nice, really.
It's like that meme where like the mom says, we have like food at home, or we have reverse ETL at home, or we have data pipelines at home. I don't know if you've seen it,
No, I
but
didn't. I didn't.
I'll send it to you after.
So, yeah,
But it's exactly like that meme.
yeah, yeah. It really like a situation that happens quite frequently. And another one that I see as an investor with a data science type of project, again, more on the data science, not on an engineering side or DevOps side. So what I notice is that sometimes these data science things, the value from them comes not quite quickly. So you can build a nice predictive tool, and until a certain event happens, your
Mhm.
predictions, they are kind of uh, the value is pretty much zero. For instance, in manufacturing, before your engine or pumping machine breaks down and you predicted it, the value is kind of zero. Uh, do you know? Have you guys noticed that in your case, people also expect some measurable, maybe things to understand the value of the product in the give in a very short term perspective, or they are ready to wait? And what's your approach to that?
Yeah, for teams that already have like in-house pipelines, definitely, because they need to know the delta, right? Like I already have data in my tool, but what else can I get into my tool if I use something like this?
Mhm.
And that delta is not necessarily created by us, right? It's created by their analytics or data science team that's computing the fields that we're getting in. So for example, like maybe they have churn risk or they have LTV and their data science team computed that. Our product is only as useful as how good that data is and whether that's useful to the marketing team or the sales team. So certainly for those types of companies, but the majority of companies we talk to, they already have like a laundry list of like 30 things that they don't know about their users that they wish they had in their tools. And they know how to find those 30 things in Looker and Tableau and Metabase. And so like in those cases, like there's already a big gap between like what is being done in the company and what can be done with data. And so it becomes much easier. One thing that we haven't gotten really good at is like kind of bridging the gap between data science and business users. So like data teams is like relatively like easy, right? Because they sit almost on the marketing or sales teams and like help those business users directly. Data science is kind of like a little bit more like it feels a little bit more separate to me, where like they're doing a lot of like complicated math and algorithms in order to find some sort of metric or like user understanding. But then like I feel like usually data science gets fed back into the product rather than getting fed back into like marketing and sales. And it would be great if like we could speak with more data teams and understand like which metrics are you working on that directly affect marketing and sales, and how do those metrics get back to marketing and sales. Because my understanding is that usually it's like something like a CSV download
Mhm.
and then you upload that to your marketing tool. But if you could continuously upload predictive analytics into your tool, like you could actually build really powerful workflows out of data science. Like I think it's like almost like a natural extension to say like, oh, after user does like X certain patterns, user's pissed off and we need to alert someone as soon as possible to talk to that user.
Mhm.
And like currently I feel like companies do that like a little bit too late. Like they'll do that like a week later because that's when the account manager goes in and checks the Looker dashboard to see like high risk users. But if those high risk users were alerted in Slack and you just received a DM that said, oh, user just became high risk 5 minutes ago, you ping them 10 minutes later, they're happy 10 minutes later, like you're good to go.
Mhm. Mhm. It's very interesting that you mentioned this CSV thing. I guess my observation as an investor, not a data science guy, obviously, what I see that data science teams within old school offline industries like insurance operate exactly like
Mm-hmm.
that. So when you sell something to them, they tell you, okay, we need a CSV, send me that update, and I will like ask you for that CSV file once in a week, let's say. But if you look at more digital native industries or maybe e-commerce, then it's really much faster. It's less about CSVs and more about integrations within either the product or some decisions that made, let's say, hourly or daily, like assortment, pricing, something like that. So I guess it depends on industry, but that's my outside kind of note rather than
Yeah.
and feedback from a data scientist. I guess it's an interesting sector to look at how you can work more with the data science teams. And I guess just to be cautious of your time, I guess we covered a lot of things and a lot of product related things and tech related things. But is there any theme or question maybe that we didn't talk about, but you believe that it deserves to be discussed and maybe talked through?
Well, maybe a couple things. One, we want to encourage people to think of reverse ETL as, like, again, more than data syncing from point A to point B. So like what Hightouch really aims to be, right, and like what we're building towards is to be some sort of layer on top of the data warehouse that makes the data warehouse extremely useful to business users. And so that in one format of that is great. Your data warehouse data is now available in your SaaS tools, so your business users can use it there. Another format of that is we actually have this visual query builder that lets anyone build audiences on the data warehouse. And instead of having to understand concepts in SQL like joins and group bys, you simply have to understand like what is a user account, purchase, product, that kind of stuff, and be able to like visually describe like, okay, I want to know all organizations that have more than N number of users, or all organizations that have more than N number of users in this city that are above a certain age. Like be able to describe those things in a very visual way. And we'll build those audiences for you on top of the data warehouse by compiling it down to SQL, and then help you send those audiences to other places. So one really clear example of that is ad tools like Google and Facebook actually don't have audience builders. Like they have audience builders for their own data, like if you want to use Google's data or Facebook's data. But if you want to use your own primary data, like whatever you have in the data warehouse, you actually can't build audiences within Facebook and Google. You have to build audiences in your SQL query or like in whatever CSV upload you do. And so that's a really clear example of a case where it's actually really beneficial for Hightouch to build those audiences for you and to let your marketer build those audiences on top of the warehouse. And like the beauty of it is that we don't enforce a certain schema. Like you have to have a user object and an account object. We let you have like any schema you want, and we compile it all down to SQL because we abstract away the joins and we make it like really easy for people to understand. And so that's like one way that like we're bridging the difference between like data is in the data warehouse and like data is in the hands of business users. And then there's all these other things that we can do on top of the data warehouse that have not been done yet, that like even the technology may not exist for yet. Like for example, Snowflake is working on streaming, and so is BigQuery. And like once streaming is possible, then data warehouses will be able to be used for continuously updating data, like on a very low latency in other places, right? So like if you can do streaming reads, then now Snowflake can power like your Salesforce every like less than 10 milliseconds rather than every 10, 30, 40 minutes, which means that you can actually trigger things like emails or trigger things like push notifications out of the data warehouse. And again, that's like not something that anyone would ever imagine doing right now. I don't think it will be for another year or two minimum. But as it becomes more and more available, Snowflake and BigQuery will build the architecture and the infrastructure for it. But there will need to be some higher level interface that makes it possible for users to interact with this streaming interface, right? Or this like basically like data transfer interface. And that's kind of where Hightouch wants to sit. Where in Hightouch you can say, okay, can Hightouch basically for me make these columns or these rows streaming reads and then provide them for me in this place, right? Or even before we have streaming, can Hightouch simply just ETL these rows and columns into a production database or a MemSQL or some sort of like really fast in-memory database and store them for me there and give me a REST API on that data. So that way my SQL query effectively is now a REST API that I can use to access data in real time. And Hightouch updates that database every like 20 minutes. So it's fresh every 20 minutes. I get it in real time. And now I'm abstracting away the need for like engineers having to build this API. It's just enforced by a SQL query. And as the data changes in the data, in the data warehouse, and as the analytics or data engineering team models new and more data, it becomes available in the API.
Mhm.
So let's say you add 4 more columns because we have some new information about users that we want to track. Those 4 columns become available in the API and they become available with my product team. So like there's all these different things that we can do from the data warehouse that like we're just like users are just starting to think about these things and like find these things to be like the new way of running marketing, sales, and now eventually product. And that's when it gets really interesting because like the data warehouse really can become like a replacement for a lot of different types of SaaS tools. And so like another good example of that is something like feature flags. You don't really need to store feature flags in some other external party tool. Like if you store feature flags in your data warehouse, which a lot of people do, Hightouch can be that layer that serves those feature flags to your product team. And that's like, we're still a little bit far away from that, but it's very practical and it's very like in sight. Like we can see a clear path for how that would happen.
That's super cool that you return to the to the point of describing the existing infrastructure like BigQuery, streaming that will become available very soon, and what you can guys build on top of that, and describe the position of Hightouch. What I would probably like to close with is the following question. What are other opportunities maybe you can notice or you already noticed that some other entrepreneurs may look at uh, based on your knowledge of the stack, on the technological trend? So,
Yeah.
what are other cool things that somebody else may exploit or ride as a wave?
One thing we would absolutely love to see, and we have not seen a standard emerge around, is data cataloging. So in my company, I might have 7 different revenue columns, and marketing has a different definition of revenue than sales, than finance. And I need to understand which revenue is which, right? Or which users table is which. I might have like 30 users tables, and I don't know the difference. So like data cataloging at especially at big companies becomes extremely important to know like which column is what and which table is what. And there's no standard for it. Like there is like metadata fields in like most modern SQL databases. And I think currently DBT is best positioned to work on something like this and make it possible for you to update those metadata files. But not everyone uses DBT, right? And like there could be some sort of universal standard that's basically just like a CRUD app on top of like the built-in metadata fields in SQL databases, so that companies have a good view of like what table is what and what column is what. So I think cataloging is basically completely missing. There are a lot of startups working on it, but no one has really become a standard. And it's probably gonna have to be something open source and something like very easily accessible. So I think cataloging is definitely one. Another one that we've actually started working on an open source package for this, but I think it would be extremely useful, is there's different ways companies do modeling, right? So DBT has become like a pretty big standard, but LookML, PDTs is another example. In some ways, like building views in like Looker or Tableau is another example of modeling. And there's all these different ways that, and like Dataform is another example, right? So if there was some universal standard to transfer between these, like, can I convert my DBT models into LookML models and vice versa? And like my Metabase, like what is it called? Questions. Can I convert those into like into DBT models and vice versa? And bidirectionally sync those at all times? That would be pretty game changing because there's a lot of users that only understand Looker. And so they can only build models for themselves in Looker. And those models don't exist in your database because they're not DBT models or they're not materialized or they're not views, right? And so if you could always have a one-to-one mapping of like, oh, just materialize this for me or just make this a view for me. And now boom, it shows up in DBT and now like I can change it here on the data team side and the business user side. It will become a really good bridge for modeling. Hopefully I'm not giving too much away there, but I think that will be like, like a very interesting, like,
Exactly the thing that I guess may help to broaden horizons for people.
yeah.
Because what I sometimes see is that people really focus too much on parts that they love and understand, and they dive very deeply. But sometimes they miss this wider technological trends that allow companies to basically hop on these trends, hop on
Oh,
the backs of technological giants like Google with BigQuery, and basically make it better.
yeah. I mean, what we really want to see is like teams sharing work with each other. So like we've seen that like, okay, like a lot of teams are now sharing infrastructure with each other, right? But like I do the modeling work here in my warehouse and I want to share that work with everyone in the company. Or my marketing analyst does analysis work in Looker and they want to share that work with the rest of the marketing team and the data team. That's the part that's completely missing. The work is becoming isolated in the tool that you're doing the work in. And so if those models can be shared and analysis can be shared more easily, I think the warehouse is the right place to eventually store the results in the model, but sharing the model is the hard part.
And I guess we will see more of that kind of sharing, and partially because of data science, because
Yeah.
machine learning models, they kind of need to be transparent. Somebody who is on the business side needs to know how that actually works. And I guess you can start from machine learning and from these models, but you can go deeper into the stack and to actually ask people how deeper things work as well, because they affect all these models. So I guess it's the right time to think about shareability, uh, about being like about transparency of the stack and about model. So I guess you're in the very right time, guys, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot of good things and news from you.
Yeah, and it's already kind of happening too with like Airflow and DBT, like, and like in the past there were like more like ancient tools like SQL Server integration services, but like being able to see like here's the DAG of like here's where this data comes from to here to here to here is like actually very useful, and like it's not that commonly used, right? Like and like making sure that like work on raw data actually influences like the end result and like where it's coming from. That sort of lineage work, I think that is still missing too. But that's something where we want like someone ideally like either DBT or like maybe us to like be able to say like here's the lineage of where this data came from. It came in through segment event collection. It was transformed through these like series of 7 queries and models, and then like it was here, and then we Hightouch brought it into Salesforce, and here's the part of the like model that was messed up that caused this thing to fail for 7 days. Like all those things kind of matter, especially at the enterprise level. So there's definitely a ton of work to be done, but the thing that makes me happy is that the right people and like many teams are working on it simultaneously. So like I think the future for data is going to be really good.
That's, I guess, a very good point to close our today's talk. Thank you very much, Kashish, for talking to us today, and looking forward to hear good news and updates from you guys.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me.